There's a moment, and maybe you know this moment, where you're standing alone in your kitchen at 11 p.m. and you say it out loud, not to anyone, not to your phone, not to a pet sleeping in the corner, just out loud to the empty room. Maybe it's something small. Okay, just breathe. Maybe it's an argument you're replaying from 3 days ago and you're finally saying the thing you should have said. Maybe it's a grocery list. Maybe it's your own name, spoken quietly, like a question, and then something interesting happens. You catch yourself. You look around even though you know you're alone, and a small wave of embarrassment moves through you, like you just did something strange, something you shouldn't admit to. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. Why does that feel embarrassing? You weren't hurting anyone. You weren't being irrational. In fact, in that moment, you were doing something deeply, profoundly human, something people have done since the beginning of language itself. And yet the shame arrives so quickly, so automatically. We've built a world where talking to yourself is shorthand for losing your mind. The movies taught us this. The playground taught us this. Who are you talking to? There's nobody there, but here's the truth that most people never stop long enough to consider. There is someone there. There has always been someone there. The question, the one that changes everything, isn't why you talk to yourself. It's who you're talking to, and more importantly, who is doing the talking. Because inside the mind of someone who talks to themselves, there isn't one voice, there are several. There's the voice that criticizes, the voice that soothes, the voice that narrates your life like a documentary you didn't agree to star in, the voice that shows up at 3 a.m. with a list of every mistake you've ever made, and somewhere beneath all of them, quieter, steadier, harder to hear, is the voice that's been trying to reach you for years. Today we're going to go somewhere most psychology videos don't go. We're not just going to talk about whether self-talk is healthy or unhealthy. We're going to pull back the curtain on what it actually means, what it reveals about your inner architecture, your earliest relationships, and the parts of yourself that are still waiting to be heard. Stay with me. What we're about to explore is stranger and more beautiful than you might expect. Let's start at the beginning. Not your beginning, language's beginning. Long before humans had writing, long before philosophy or science or therapy, we had something remarkable, the ability to speak to ourselves inside our own minds. Developmental psychologists call this inner speech. And it's one of the most uniquely human capabilities we possess. It's not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, writing in the early 20th century, was one of the first to study this seriously. He observed young children 3, 4, 5 years old narrating their own actions as they played. Now the block goes here. Now the tower falls. Now I fix it. He didn't see pathology. He saw cognition in action. He saw a child using language to organize reality, to self-regulate, to think. What Vygotsky understood, and what modern neuroscience has since confirmed, is that outer speech doesn't disappear as we grow up. It turns inward. It becomes the constant, quiet murmur that lives behind your eyes. That voice reading these words right now? That's it. That's the thing we're talking about. But here's where it gets interesting. Research published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology found that the way you conduct your inner speech, the pronouns you use, specifically has a measurable effect on your emotional regulation and performance under stress. People who referred to themselves in third person during self-talk, saying their own name rather than "I can do this," showed significantly lower anxiety, higher confidence, and better problem-solving ability. Read that again. The simple act of creating a tiny psychological distance between you and your experience, enough distance to use your own name, changes what your nervous system does with fear. Psychologists call this self-distancing. It's when you step back from the first person I and observe yourself from a slight remove, like a compassionate witness rather than a drowning participant. And what's fascinating is that people who talk to themselves out loud are often doing this naturally, instinctively, without knowing the science. They have stumbled onto a coping mechanism that centuries of human experience have quietly passed down. Now let's go deeper, because the content of your self-talk and the tone of it doesn't appear from nowhere. It was taught to you. Think about the voice that narrates your inner world right now. Is it warm? Is it harsh? Does it reassure you, or does it catalog your failures? Does it sound anything like someone you used to know? Here's what developmental psychology tells us. The internal voice you use to talk to yourself is, in large part, constructed from the voices of your earliest caregivers. This is what psychoanalyst W. Winnicott described as internalization, the psychological process by which we absorb the emotional tone, the language, and the relational patterns of the people who raised us and make them our own. A child who grew up with a patient, encouraging parent, a parent who said, "Let's figure this out together" when things went wrong, often develops an inner voice that speaks with that same quality of patient exploration. A child who grew up with a critical, dismissive, or anxious parent may develop an inner voice that interrogates, belittles, or catastrophizes. You didn't choose your inner narrator, but you were shaped by it. And here's the part that sits uncomfortably with most people. Many of us have been walking around for decades, listening to a voice we believe is ours, our authentic inner experience, not realizing it was borrowed, not realizing that the cruelty we direct at ourselves in moments of failure, the way we talk ourselves out of wanting things, the relentless self-monitoring, that voice was installed. A study published in Clinical Psychological Science found that people with histories of childhood emotional neglect reported significantly higher levels of what researchers called hostile inner speech and inner voice, characterized by contempt, blame, and hopelessness, not because something was broken in them, but because in the absence of a warm external voice, the mind turned to whatever was available and built something out of that. The mind always builds something. It cannot live in silence. But here's what nobody tells you, and this is the piece that changes everything. The voice that criticizes you is not the deepest voice. It is often the loudest. It is often the most familiar, but it is not the most true. Beneath the critic, beneath the narrator, beneath the anxiety voice that rehearses every possible way something could go wrong, there is another presence. Quieter, more patient. The part of you that still reaches for beauty, that still knows somewhere what it needs. Psychologists call this the observing self, a term rooted in acceptance and commitment therapy developed by Stephen Hayes. It's the part of you that can watch your own thoughts without being them. The part that hears the critical voice and says quietly, that's a thought, that's not a fact. People who talk to themselves out loud are often, without knowing it, trying to activate this observing self. They are trying to get outside the loop of their own internal experience long enough to hear something different, to hear something true. Now let's talk about what this actually looks like in your life, because the psychology is interesting, but the living of it is where the real recognition happens. Think about the last time you talked to yourself out loud, not the content, just the situation. Where were you? What were you navigating? Chances are it was a moment of transition or difficulty. Getting ready for something that scared you, processing something that confused you, trying to complete a task while managing an emotional undercurrent you couldn't quite name. This is the first manifestation, self-talk as rehearsal. You are not just talking, you are preparing, you are running the scenario, testing the words, building a bridge between the internal experience and the external world. When you mutter, okay, here's what I'm going to say before a difficult conversation, you are using language to organize chaos into something you can step into. This is genuinely one of the most sophisticated things a mind can do. But here's the truth about the people who do this most intensely. Most habitually, the ones for whom the inner commentary never quite stops. Often there's something more complex happening. You might be someone who grew up in a home where the emotional atmosphere was unpredictable, where love was present but conditional, where you learned early that it was safer to process things alone quietly, internally, than to reach for someone who might not be reachable. And so your mind became your safest companion. You might have developed a habit of narrating your own life because nobody was narrating it with you, because the adults around you were managing their own floods, and you learned to be your own witness, to document your own experience in real time, because if you didn't hold it, no one would. You might talk to yourself not just to think, but to be heard. Even if the only ears available are your own, sit with that for a moment. Even if the only ears available are your own, there's a particular loneliness in that, and there's also something extraordinary in it because it means you never entirely gave up. The impulse to speak, to articulate, to reach outward with language even when no one was listening, that impulse kept something alive in you, but, and this matters, the voice you developed in that aloneness may have taken on shadows. Here's where it gets interesting. People who are highly verbal internal processors, people who use language constantly to manage their internal world, often develop something psychologists call repetitive negative thinking, This is the experience of inner speech getting stuck in a loop. The same conversation, the same regret, the same fear revisited, examined, re-experienced, not because the examination is helping, but because the mind doesn't know how to stop moving through a pain it never fully resolved. A study in behavior research and therapy found that individuals with high rates of repetitive negative thinking showed increased activation in the default mode network, the brain's inward-facing system, active when we ruminate, replay, and self-reference, and reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for perspective and problem-solving. In plain language, the loop isn't thinking, it's avoiding the feeling that thinking was supposed to process. You talk to yourself, and sometimes, instead of resolution, the talking leads you deeper into the maze. You might recognize this pattern. You replay a conversation not once, not twice, but 17 times, each time slightly differently, each time looking for the version that makes you feel less culpable, less hurt, or simply less confused. You construct elaborate internal dialogues with people who aren't in the room. You have arguments you win and apologies you receive, and moments of clarity that dissolve the moment you open your eyes, and then you feel exhausted, not from doing anything, from thinking, from the sheer metabolic cost of being so constantly, effortfully present inside your own head. This is the shadow side of being a person who talks to themselves. Not madness, never madness, but a mind that turned toward language as its primary tool, and sometimes uses that tool to dig deeper instead of to climb out. Now let's talk about relationships, because this is where the self-talk pattern becomes most visible to the people around you. You might find that you process aloud that you need to speak something before you fully understand it, and the people close to you sometimes feel like they're watching you think rather than talking to them. This can be isolating for both of you. You don't quite understand why they seem uncomfortable with your unfinished thoughts. They don't quite understand that you're not asking to be fixed, you're asking to be witnessed. There's a difference, and most people were never taught that difference. You might also find that your inner voice, the one you've been living with for decades, has an opinion about everything you do, every choice, every risk, every moment of vulnerability, and that voice may sound like protection. Don't get too close, don't want too much, don't say that they'll think you're too much. But here's what's worth examining: protection from what? And toward what end? Because some of the inner voices we carry were formed in environments that were genuinely dangerous, where openness was punished, where need was inconvenient, where being too much led to abandonment or anger. Those voices were adaptive. They kept you safe when safe was the most important thing. The problem is, you're no longer 7 years old, and the voice doesn't always know that. We're halfway through something important here. Stay with me. Because here's the question that changes the whole conversation. What if the purpose of self-talk, the deepest, most fundamental purpose, is not to solve problems or rehearse conversations or manage anxiety? What if it's to stay in relationship with yourself? Think about that. In every moment you speak to yourself, even the critical moments, even the loops, you are refusing to entirely disappear. You are insisting at some level on your own presence, on the validity of your own experience. You are saying, I am here, this is happening, I matter enough to narrate. That impulse, however distorted the voice has become, is not pathology. It is the seed of something whole. Carl Jung wrote something that I keep returning to. He wrote, who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakes. People who talk to themselves are, almost by definition, people who look inside, and waking up, truly waking up to the landscape of your own inner world, is not comfortable. It is, in fact, one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have, because when you start listening, really listening to what your inner voices are saying and why and whose words they're carrying, you begin to see the architecture of your own psychology with a clarity that can feel overwhelming. You realize the critic is not you. You realize the catastrophist is not you. You realize the voice that says you're too much learned that line from someone who couldn't hold the full weight of who you are. This is what Jung called shadow work. The process of encountering the parts of yourself that have been operating in the dark, not to destroy them, not to silence them, but to recognize them, to understand their origin, and to stop being governed by them without realizing it. There's a reason that therapy, when it works, is largely a conversation. You speak, the therapist reflects. And something about the act of articulating your inner world to another person, someone who listens without flinching, begins to loosen the knots. The mind, which has been talking to itself in circles, finally finds a listener. But here's the insight that most people miss. You can begin to be that listener for yourself, not by silencing the critical voice that rarely works, but by introducing something new into the inner conversation. A voice that asks, is that true? All of it? Or is that fear speaking? A voice that says, that was hard, you handled something hard. A voice that doesn't rush to fix, but simply stays. This is what psychologist Kristen Neff calls self-compassion, not a soft, indulgent concept, but a rigorous, research-supported practice of speaking to yourself with the same quality of care you would offer a person you genuinely love in distress. Research from the Journal of Research in Personality found that individuals who practiced self-compassionate inner speech showed lower rates of anxiety and depression, greater emotional resilience, and a more stable sense of self, not because their problems disappeared, but because the voice accompanying them through the problems changed. And here's the paradox, the beautiful, strange paradox at the center of all of this. The people who talk to themselves the most are often the people who understand loneliness most deeply, and yet they carry within them the instrument of their own company, a voice, a presence, a witness that has been there through every dark night and every quiet morning, that has never actually abandoned them, even when it was harsh, even when it looped, even when it lied. You have been your own companion all along. You just haven't always known how to speak to yourself with kindness. There's something I want you to consider doing. Not a list, not a protocol, just one small, strange, courageous thing. The next time you catch yourself talking to yourself in the car, in the kitchen, in the quiet space between waking and sleeping, don't flinch. Don't reach for the shame. Instead, get curious. Not why am I doing this, but what does this voice need right now? Because the part of you that reaches for language in the middle of difficulty is not broken. It is trying. It is doing the most human thing there is, attempting to make meaning out of experience, to organize chaos into words, to refuse to let something important pass unnamed and unwitnessed. Healing for someone like you doesn't begin with silence. It begins with a different quality of speech. It begins when the voice that has spent years narrating your failures starts to narrate your endurance. When the voice that rehearsed every way something could go wrong starts to stay present with how something is going right. When the inner conversation shifts from interrogation to curiosity, from prosecution to witness. This doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't happen because you decide it will. It happens in small moments, in the same small moments where the old patterns used to live. It happens the first time you catch the critical voice mid-sentence and you pause, and you say out loud or inside, "That's not mine." It happens when you narrate yourself through something hard and at the end you say, "That was difficult and I stayed anyway." It happens when, instead of replaying the conversation you wish you'd had, you ask yourself, "What do I actually need right now?" And then here is the part that changes everything. You answer honestly. Remember what I said at the beginning? That there's someone there in the empty room when you speak? That person, the one who has been listening all along, is you. The real you, the one beneath the borrowed critic and the anxious narrator and the voice that was installed before you were old enough to choose. That voice doesn't need to be louder than the others. It just needs to be heard. You have been talking to yourself your whole life. Maybe it's time to start listening differently. You were never talking to no one. You were always, in some quiet way, trying to come home. Drop a comment below and tell me, what does your inner voice sound like? Is it kind? Is it harsh? Has it ever surprised you? I read every single one.